This video comparison will examine the teen movie genre by comparing Michael Lemon's black comedy Heathers and Mark Waters' comedy Mean Girls. The teen genre emerged in the 1950s, and many would argue that it was solidified in the 80s, where production boomed as studios began to heavily target teenagers. Perhaps most notable are the works of John Hughes, whose films such as The Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off created an arguably idealistic teen world. Heathers, released in 1989, aims to counter these films and, through dark comedy, comment on the newly recognized effects of the media on teenagers. On the other hand, Mean Girls came out in 2004, coinciding with the rising popularity of SNL, cringe comedy, chick flicks, and female comedians such as the film's screenwriter Tina Fey. On the surface, these two films seem very similar. Yet despite only being 15 years apart, the two have massively different cultural contexts due to how quickly the concept and world of the teenager changes. Specifically, I'll be looking at the way Heathers and Mean Girls use similar teen film conventions such as high school hierarchy, as well as the differences regarding the representation of the media and women, to draw conclusions on who each film blames for teenage strife. Oftentimes, teen movies use high school societal structure as a microcosm of society at large. This is a common convention of the teen film that plays an important role in both the plots and wider messages of Heathers and Mean Girls. In the climax of Heathers, we see JD explicitly express,
"The school was society!"
communicating to the audience that even though the film is about high school on a surface level, its commentary is much more meaningful. Some analysts argue that Heather Chandler's red color coding pitted against Veronica's blue color coding represents the politics at the time. The 1980s were defined by economic recession, the growing AIDS epidemic, tensions amidst the ongoing Cold War, and the wave of conservatism that emerged with the Reagan administration. Because of this, people grouped themselves amongst people with similar opinions and demonized the opposition. There was a similar mentality in the early 2000s, which was defined politically by the war on terrorism and the push towards conservatism following the 9/11 attacks. This explains the similarities between Heathers and Mean Girls' portrayal of high school cliques if they're to be interpreted as representative of political divisions. Furthermore, Mean Girls' strict societal groups create meaningful commentary on how society forces people into a box based on certain characteristics, restricting their individuality. Katie's comparisons between the African wild and the high school throughout the film serve as a visual representation of the way our society, just like wild animals, is based around finding your group and fitting in order to survive. Heathers and Mean Girls are similar in that they reject the notion that teens should participate in clique culture. Both films portraying all cliques as equally undesirable illustrates this. In Heathers, the audience initially sees the appeal of JD's counterculture rebellion alongside our protagonist Veronica, but we gradually become disenchanted as his isolationist outcast mentality ends up equally as bad as the popular cliques. Meanwhile, Janice Ian's actions mirroring Regina George's actions in Mean Girls present both cliques as equally bad, albeit more implicitly than Heathers does. The rejection of cliques is further shown through Mean Girls' perfect world ending where the Plastics disband. The introduction of the junior Plastics, who were looked down upon with humour by our protagonist, demonstrates that social hierarchy and popularity struggles are not an isolated issue. The best way to combat clique culture is not to be involved. This differs from the more ambiguous ending of Heathers, where Veronica takes the red scrunchie, a symbol of the Heathers' power, serving as a nail in the coffin for her involvement in clique culture. Unlike Mean Girls, there is no confirmation that this conclusion results in any wider improvement, aligning with the film's darker tone. By having their protagonists reject the social structures forced upon them, combined with the way these have been presented as allegorical for timeless political conflicts, both Heathers and Mean Girls blame the pressure of these cliques for the many struggles that teenagers face, agreeing that we should strive for liberation from these boxes society tries to group us into. Somewhere where Heathers and Mean Girls widely differ due to their cultural context is their portrayal of the media's effect on teenagers. In Heathers, a large portion of the film revolves around the media and its romanticization of the teenage experience. During the 1980s, people were more aware of the ever-growing media's effect. Some even used the term MTV generation for people growing up at the time due to the extent to which their lives were affected by the evolving media.
And the MTV video games.
In addition, awareness of teen mental health issues increased. The decade saw a sudden rise in the suicide rates for people between the ages of 5 and 19, overtaking the previous highest risk group of people over 65. However, at the time, people weren't as focused on helping teens as they were fascinated by the phenomena. Many shows would romanticize teen struggles such as mental health and suicide. Heathers, as a black comedy, utilizes aspects of horror to place the blame on the media and reflect its dark infatuation with teen suicide.
These little programs are eating suicide up with a spoon. They're making it sound like it's a cool thing to do.
This is very different in Mean Girls, where Waters doesn't blame the media but internal pressures. Some may argue that the burn book is a symbol for social media, which was emerging in the early 2000s as sites such as Facebook launching in 2004. However, the burn book itself is not blamed for the trouble it caused. Rather, the fault lies with the girls who wrote it. This may be because social media was so new at the time that people didn't understand its issues and instead blamed its users. Heather's critique of the media aligns with Stuart Hall's representation theory. This theory argues that the media doesn't reflect pre-existing meaning, but instead creates it. This is seen in the movie with the response to the faked suicides. Adults are more fascinated than concerned.
I must say I was impressed to see that she made proper use of the word myriad in her suicide note.
And the newfound pity and respect for the dead students turns shallow, revenge-fueled murders into suicides full of hidden depth, reflecting the way the media shapes people's perceptions. The absurdist imagery and hyperbole used when Veronica imagines what would happen if she killed Heather Duke epitomizes these critiques. The same thing happens with Kurt and Ram's murder being framed as a homosexual suicide pact. Here, Lemon makes it abundantly clear the media's fixation on teenage mental health doesn't come from a place of concern, but rather fascination. During the 1980s, homophobia was rampant, especially because of the AIDS epidemic. Yet when Kurt and Ram's death was a supposed result of homophobia, people are quick to give their support.
How do you think he'd react to a son that had a limp wrist with a pulse?
Through this, Lemon comments on society's shallow interest in the issues teenagers at the time faced. Kurt and Ram would have received hate for being openly gay in life, but when a sensationalist death occurs, people treat it as a spectator sport. Heather's exploration of the media's relationship with teenage mental health could be considered reflective of the general public's reaction towards the AIDS epidemic, which began in the 1980s and increased steadily throughout the decade with over 100,000 reported cases in the United States by 1989. Because HIV and AIDS disproportionately affected gay and bisexual men, it was stigmatized as a gay disease, and so, until cases started to appear amongst heterosexual couples, people paid little mind and often blamed homosexuality itself for the disease. This is similar to how the teenage suicide epidemic isn't being treated seriously by the adults in Heathers, but rather stigmatized with the teenagers themselves being blamed. The attention Heather McNamara and Martha Dunstock's real attempts receive compared to the faked suicides comment on how little people really cared about understanding suicidal teens. It also reflects how during the AIDS epidemic, there was sympathy towards certain demographics only when their group was considered acceptable.
Just another case of a geek trying to imitate the popular people of the school and failing miserably.
Another point of comparison between these two films is their representation of women. Mean Girls was released in 2004, coinciding with the tail end of third-wave feminism. Since the more tangible problems such as voting rights and birth control access had been tackled by the earlier waves, third-wave feminism focused on reflecting a more abstract internalized prejudice against women, including internalized misogyny. Mean Girls reflects these ideas in the gymnasium scene, where Miss Norbury expresses that
You all have got to stop calling each other sluts and whores. It just makes it okay for guys to call you sluts and whores.
In contrast, Heather's 1989 release date coincides with the tail end of second-wave feminism, meaning it's more focused on external factors harming women. JD, a male character, being both the film's main source of conflict and a toxic partner to Veronica is the key indicator of this. The mean girl trope exploded in the 1990s and early 2000s, coinciding with Jorkvist's research on female aggression. This research concluded that while men are more openly aggressive, women grow up in a world where they aren't allowed to express their anger in the same way as men and therefore develop relational aggression. This means that they weaponize their relationships and their aggression comes through in the form of emotional manipulation and bullying.
And in Girl World, all the fighting had to be sneaky.
This is seen multiple times throughout Mean Girls, particularly with Regina George's character. At the film's conclusion, Regina joins the lacrosse team. Here, Mean Girls implies that Regina's meanness stems from a situation where putting other women down is the only way to express her anger. By finding a way to express her anger helpfully, Regina begins to escape the trap of relational aggression and internalized misogyny. Furthermore, the gymnasium scene draws specific attention to relational aggression when Miss Norbury states that girls must learn to express their anger in a healthy way, implying that, like Jorkvist concluded, they've been conditioned not to do so. This is unlike Heather's, where, despite being the titular characters, its mean girls aren't given the same amount of depth. The brief insight Lemon gives of McNamara's suicide attempt is outweighed by the one-dimensionality of Heather Chandler and Duke.
Heather, why can't you just be a friend? Why are you such a mega bitch?
Because I can be.
Overall, while both films may seem similar on the surface, their cultural contexts result in very different messages on who is to blame for the teenage struggle. While both films comment on the negative effects of social structures and cliques, rejecting the notion that teens should participate in them, that is where the similarities end. Heathers, being released in the late 1980s, pushes a message about the harmful effects of the media and adults romanticizing the teenage experience. However, Mean Girls' ties to third-wave feminism and research on female aggression shifts the blame onto the high school girls themselves for perpetuating a damaging social system.